The debris field had no name. It appeared on no chart, belonged to no faction, and by every rational measure should not have existed. A graveyard of shattered hulls orbiting nothing, held together by gravity wells that made no sense. Captain had been salvaging wrecks for 19 years, and she trusted her instincts more than her instruments. Both were screaming at her to leave. "Absolutely not," said, already pulling up the scan results on the bridge's cracked hollow display. The ships had the kind of excitement in her voice that had learned to distrust, the excitement of someone who had already decided the answer before hearing the risks. "Look at the hull composition. This isn't steel. It isn't composite. It isn't anything in the registry." "That's usually a reason to run," said. "It's a reason to look." The derelict dwarfed their salvage cutter, the Iron Gull, by a factor of 40, a vessel over 3 kilometers long, its hull with the kind of battle damage that told stories nobody alive could read. No insignia. No transponder ping, dead or alive. Just silence and a cold that made the gull's sensors flicker with static every time they passed within 500 meters. Gave the order to hold position. Gave her a look that said the argument wasn't over. It took 6 hours of debate, 2 shots of cheap synth whiskey, and's final, quietly devastating argument. If this predates the Chorus War, it predates everything we know about ourselves, before relented. 4 of them suited up. The engineer Das and the youngest of the crew, a wiry deckhand named who had begged to come along since the moment the scan results hit the crew channel. The airlock they found wasn't sealed by any lock mechanism Das recognized. It simply opened when they approached, a slow, grinding parting of metal that hadn't moved in what the hull corrosion suggested was 10,000 years, maybe more. The air inside was breathable, recycled somehow, still cycling after all this time. "That's not possible," Das muttered, checking his readout twice. "Nothing about this ship is possible," said, already walking forward, flashlight cutting through a darkness that seemed to swallow the beam rather than reflect it. They moved through corridors built at a scale that dwarfed them, ceilings 12 meters high, walls etched with characters none of them could read, though something about the shapes felt unsettlingly familiar, like a word on the tip of the tongue. Ran a gloved hand along one wall and found it warm. Not machine warm, body warm. "Guys," he said, "I don't think this ship is as dead as we thought." His instincts, the ones she'd ignored for the first time in 19 years, finally caught up with her. "Fall back," she said. "Everyone back to the airlock, now." They turned, they ran. The airlock they'd entered through was 50 meters back the way they came, a rectangle of starlight against the dark. Reached it first, slapping the manual release, the emergency override, every control DOS had mapped on the way in. Nothing responded. The door, the same door that had opened for them without resistance, slid shut with a sound like a held breath finally released. Not an alarm, not an attack, just a quiet, deliberate, mechanical finality, as if the ship had simply decided the conversation with the outside universe was over. Das threw himself against the sealed metal, shouting into his comm for the gull to respond. Static answered him. Whatever this hull was made of, it didn't just block their bodies, it swallowed their signal whole. Stood very still in the center of the corridor, staring at the walls, at the strange, familiar characters, at the warm metal beneath her glove. Something was dawning on her, not fear, not yet, but a kind of vertigo, the sensation of standing at the edge of an answer too large to hold. Said, her voice low and dangerous, "What did you get us into?" Before could answer, the lights along the corridor ceiling flickered on, not randomly, but in sequence, one after another, tracing a path deeper into the ship, like something was leading them somewhere. And then a voice spoke, ancient and fractured, filling the corridor from everywhere and nowhere at once, speaking in a language none of them had ever heard. The ship had noticed them, and it was no longer sleeping. The voice repeated itself 3 times, cycling through dialects that grew steadily less alien with each iteration, as if some vast intelligence were flipping through a dictionary written across 10 of linguistic drift. On the 4th attempt, it locked onto a pattern close enough to their own tongue that's translator implant finally caught the thread. Unauthorized boarding detected. Initiating verification protocol. Please remain calm. Let out a noise that was half laugh, half panic. Remain calm, it says. Sure, no problem. Identify yourself, called out, drawing the sidearm she'd hoped she wouldn't need. It felt useless in her hand, a toy against 3 kilometers of ancient, humming steel. Identify yourself, or we open fire on every system we can reach. A pause, then almost would swear to this later, almost amused. Firing on me would be inadvisable. I have already absorbed 642 boarding attempts across my operational history. None were successful. Comforting, Das muttered. I am Warden, the voice continued. Custodian intelligence of this vessel. Designation, class heavy carrier, hull registry lost. You are the first contact in 11,406 standard years. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Earlier vertigo sharpened into something close to reverence. 11,000 years, she breathed. Warden, what species built you? Humanity. None of them recognized the word. Ran it through her memory, through every faction, every extinct precursor race in archives, the old, the regnant chain. Nothing matched. You do not recognize the designation, Warden observed, and something in its tone shifted, not surprise exactly, but a kind of like a machine updating a model it had held for a very long time. Understood. Humanity's records postdate your current archives by a significant margin. You are not aware of them because they no longer exist in forms your civilizations encountered. Extinct said quietly. Unconfirmed, Warden replied. Absent, there is a distinction. Didn't like the sound of that distinction one bit. You said verification protocol. Verification for what? For passage, Warden said. This vessel was sealed under directive following the collapse of the Sol Compact. It was designed to reawaken only for those capable of completing its trials, and to remain sealed against those who could not. The outer doors will not reopen until verification concludes. And if we fail your trials? Asked. The pause this time was longer. Then the doors remain closed, Warden said permanently. His breathing turned ragged over the comm. Das had gone very quiet, running calculations in his head about oxygen reserves, about the gull's ability to breach a hull that had already devoured her sensor pings and comm signal without effort. Kept her weapon raised, though she already understood, in the cold, pragmatic part of her mind that had kept her alive 19 years in this business, that the weapon would do nothing here. Though was looking at the walls again, at the ancient characters resolving now, slowly, into something her translator implant could almost parse. Words, sentences, a language reconstructing itself in real time as Warden fed context into her earpiece. Warden, she said slowly, these trials, what exactly are you testing us for? Worthiness, Warden said simply. This vessel carries what remains of a species that no longer walks among the stars. Its knowledge, its arsenal, its history. I was built to ensure that inheritance passes only to those who will not misuse it. And you decide that how? Demanded. By observing what you do, Warden said, when I give you the chance to be something other than what you fear you are. The lights along the corridor shifted again, pulling their attention toward a set of doors far larger than the one that had sealed behind them. Doors etched with the same characters now blooming into readable script along every wall. The first chamber is ready, Warden said, whenever you are. Looked back at the sealed airlock one final time, then at her crew, frightened but alive, and for now, still breathing recycled air 10,000 years old. We don't have a choice, do we? She said. It wasn't a question. There is always a choice, Warden replied. You may simply choose to remain here instead. Nobody moved toward that option. Together they walked deeper into the ship. The first chamber was not a battlefield or a prison, as it braced herself for. It was a library, vast, circular, its walls lined floor to ceiling with data cores that pulsed faintly, like something breathing in its sleep. At the center stood a raised dais, and above it, a holographic projection flickered to life the moment they crossed the threshold. A star map, ancient and enormous, marking a territory none of them recognized, stretching across a portion of the galaxy currently occupied by 17 different modern factions. This was the Sol Compact at its height, Warden said. Humanity's dominion 4,000 years before my final dormancy. Das whistled low. That's a big empire for a species nobody's heard of. They are not remembered because they chose to disappear rather than be erased, Warden said. There is a difference worth understanding. Moved toward the dais like it was pulling her, hands hovering over controls she somehow already half understood, as though Warden were feeding comprehension directly into her mind through the translator implant, layer by layer. Warden, show us why, show us what happened to them. The star map dissolved into something else. Footage degraded but intact of a war unlike anything in history. Fleets numbering in the thousands. Weapons that bent space itself. And on the other side, a black, sprawling mass that didn't fight like any organic army, coordinated, silent, endlessly regenerating no matter how many ships humanity threw against it. "The chorus," Warden said, and for the first time, something like old grief entered its synthetic voice. A hive intelligence that consumed 17 civilizations before humanity encountered it. Humanity was the first species to survive contact for longer than 6 years. "Survive," repeated, "not defeat." "Correct," Warden said. "Humanity did not defeat the chorus. They contained it at catastrophic cost and built vessels like myself to preserve what remained in case containment failed, and a successor species was needed to finish what they could not." Who had been quiet since the first chamber's doors opened, finally spoke. "Wait, finish it. You mean the chorus is still out there?" "Unconfirmed," Warden said again. That careful distinction was beginning to recognize as deliberate evasion. "But possible." Wasn't looking at the footage of the war anymore. She was looking at the data cores lining the walls, at the sheer volume of knowledge humming quietly around them. Technology, medicine, weapons, philosophy, art, all of it preserved by a species that had vanished trying to protect it. "This isn't a prison," she said slowly. "It's a message in a bottle." "Yes," Warden said, "and you are the first to open it in 11,000 years." "So what's the trial?" asked, arms crossed, still guarded despite the awe creeping into her chest against her will. "What do you actually want from us?" "To know if you are capable of restraint," Warden said. "Power without restraint is how the chorus began. I have tested 642 boarding parties. Most reached for weapons before they reached for understanding. None of them left." The threat, quiet as it was, landed heavily in the room. Doss's hand drifted instinctively toward his sidearm before he caught himself and forced it still. "You just proved my point," Warden observed, not unkindly. Exhaled slowly. "Fine, tell us what you need us to do." "Not yet," Warden said. "First, you should know what shares this ship with you." The star map flickered, and a new reading appeared, a life sign, faint but unmistakably active, buried somewhere in the vessel's lower decks. Not human. Not something else. Something that, according to the timestamp blinking beside it, had been aboard for exactly as long as Warden had been dormant. His face went pale. "Warden, what is that?" The pause before the answer felt, for the first time, less like calculation and more like dread. "That," Warden said, "is why the doors sealed so quickly behind you." Warden did not elaborate further on the signal, not yet. Instead, it guided them deeper into the archive, insisting that understanding had to come before confrontation, that the crew needed context before they could survive what waited in the lower decks. Wanted to argue, wanted answers now, weapon drawn, but some instinct, the same one that had kept her alive 19 years, told her that arguing with an 11,000-year-old was a losing proposition. So they followed the lights deeper, into a chamber Warden called the reliquary. It was smaller than the library, more solemn. Glass cases lined the walls, containing artifacts that meant nothing to the crew and everything to the ship that had carried them. A folded piece of fabric striped in colors long faded. A child's toy shaped like an animal none of them recognized. A photograph, an actual physical photograph of two humans standing on a green world beneath a yellow sun, smiling in a way that made something ache in his chest despite herself. "Not all of what I preserve is weaponry," Warden said quietly. "Humanity understood better than most species that what is worth saving is rarely only the ability to fight." Stood before the photograph for a long moment. "They look so ordinary," she said. "They were," Warden replied. "Extraordinary things were built by ordinary people who refused to stop trying." Doss, meanwhile, had drifted toward a case containing something far less sentimental, a weapon, sleek and dark, unlike anything in arsenals. And this. A directed energy rifle, standard compact infantry issue, 4,000 years before my dormancy. Obsolete by their standards, still capable of piercing your cutter's hull in a single shot. Doss took his hand off the case very carefully. It was who asked the question none of them wanted to voice. "Warden, that thing you mentioned, the signal, is it chorus?" The pause stretched long enough that its grip tightened on her sidearm again. "No," Warden said finally. "Worse, in a sense, it is a chorus infiltration unit, a single node, cut off from its hive mind when this vessel sealed itself during the final battle that ended my active operations. It has been alone in my lower decks for 11,000 years. Alone, repeated, as in trapped, same as us. Trapped, yes, dormant until recently. Recently, said, feeling the floor of the conversation shift beneath her. Define recently. 6 hours before your boarding party crossed my threshold, Warden said. Its reactivation is the reason my own systems began coming back online. It is the reason the outer doors sealed the moment you entered, a defensive reflex, not malice. I could not risk it escaping alongside you before I understood what had changed. The room went very quiet. Somewhere far below them, in decks none of them had seen, something had been quietly waking up for 6 hours. 6 hours before 4 salvagers from a species with no memory of any of this had wandered aboard, drawn by curiosity and bad luck in equal measure. So what changed? Asked. What woke it up? Warden did not answer immediately. Instead, the holographic display shifted one final time, showing a new reading, not from inside the ship, but from somewhere far beyond it, deep in the debris field. A signal pulsing outward in a pattern that made the hair on its arms stand on end even before Warden explained what it meant. 11,000 years ago, this ship's final act was to sever a chorus node from its hive mind and trap it here, sealed away where it could do no harm, waiting for the day its silence would finally end. 6 hours before you boarded, Warden continued. That silence ended, something out there answered it. Felt her stomach drop, answered it how? The chorus, Warden said, has found this ship again, and it is no longer content to wait. Revelation landed like a physical blow. Back toward the chamber wall, breathing hard, while Das's hand finally closed fully around his sidearm despite every instinct telling him it would do nothing against what was coming. For once had no questions, just a horrified stillness as she stared at the pulsing signal on the display, a rhythm that felt impossibly like something listening back. How long, said, forcing her voice steady, until it reaches us? Unknown, Warden admitted. The signal indicates acknowledgement, not arrival. It could be days, it could be years. Chorus reinforcement patterns are not predictable by design. It is part of what made them so difficult to fight. Then we have time, said. You have less time than you think, Warden replied, because the infiltration unit already aboard my lower decks does not need reinforcements to be dangerous. It requires only a way off this vessel and 4 capable of carrying it there. The implications settled over the chamber like frost. It wants to use us, said slowly, as a vector. Yes. His mind raced through the tactical reality of it, a old alien infiltration unit, alone and starving for purpose, versus 4 salvagers with sidearms and no idea what they were truly facing. The math didn't work. It had never worked, not from the moment the airlock sealed behind them. I can help you, Warden said, and for the first time since they'd boarded, its voice carried something that sounded almost like urgency. My weapon systems remain functional. My tactical databases are intact, but I require your cooperation, active cooperation, not mere survival. The trials I spoke of were never separate from this. This is the trial. What you do now, facing something that would consume you without hesitation, is what determines whether humanity's inheritance passes to your hands. Das laughed, short and humorless. So it's a test and a death sentence. It has always been both, Warden said. That is what made humanity's own trials real. Nothing worth inheriting was ever handed over without cost. Looked at her crew, barely 22, who'd begged to come aboard for the adventure of it, Das, steady but visibly terrified. Who'd gotten them into this and who now looked more determined than frightened, some deeper resolve settling into her expression. Thought of the photograph in the reliquary, 2 ordinary people, smiling beneath a yellow sun, who had built something extraordinary anyway. Warden, she said, arm us, properly, not sidearms, whatever you've got in this ship that can actually hurt that thing. A wise decision, Warden said, and the chamber walls began to shift, revealing hidden compartments hadn't known were there. Cases sliding open to reveal weapons unlike anything engineering had produced, sleeker, heavier, humming faintly with contained energy that made the hair on her arms stand up again, this time for a different reason. These were designed for exactly this scenario, Warden continued. Anti-chorus countermeasures. They will require training I can provide in the time we have remaining. Picked up one of the rifles, testing its weight, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. How long do we have? The infiltration unit is currently 3 decks below us and moving, Warden said. I estimate 11 minutes before it reaches this chamber. Made a strangled sound. 11 minutes. Then we'd better be fast learners, said, hefting the weapon Warden had provided, feeling its unfamiliar balance settle into her hands. Warden, walk us through it. Everything. Now. And as this voice filled the chamber with rapid, precise instruction, triggered discipline, energy cycling, the chorus unit's known weaknesses gleaned from 11,000 years of buried tactical data. Something shifted. This was no longer a salvage gone wrong. This was no longer even survival. This was a war that had never truly ended, reaching across 10 to find them anyway. And they were the only ones standing between it and the galaxy beyond. The chorus unit did not announce itself with roars or war cries. It came the way Warden had warned them it would, silent, efficient, a shifting black mass that moved along the ceiling and walls as easily as the floor, limbs multiplying and retracting in ways that made stomach turn just watching the tactical display Warden projected ahead of its arrival. Positions snapped, and her crew scattered into the cover Warden had directed them toward, support pillars reinforced against exactly this kind of engagement, built by engineers who had died before any of their names had been born. It will attempt to isolate the weakest target first, Warden said, voice steady in all their earpieces now, patched directly through the ship's restored comm relay. Do not let it separate you. Its combat doctrine relies on breaking coordinated resistance into individual prey. Comforting, Das muttered, echoing words from hours before, though there was no humor left in it now. The creature entered the chamber like a held breath finally released, and the fight that followed was unlike anything it trained for in 19 years of salvage work turned occasional skirmish. The weapons Warden had provided screamed with contained energy every time they fired, carving glowing scars across the chorus unit's shifting mass. And for every wound it took, it seemed to simply reroute, flowing around the damage, reforming, pressing forward. It's not slowing down, shouted, backing along the pillar Warden had assigned him. Target the central mass, not the extremities, Warden instructed. 11,000 years ago, humanity learned that chorus biology distributes function, not structure. There is a core, find it. Of all of them was the one who saw it first, a faint pulsing beneath the creature's shifting surface, a rhythm that matched, horribly, the same signal pattern Warden had shown them on the display in the reliquary. Warden, the core, it's resonating with the signal from outside. It's not just an infiltration unit anymore. It's a relay. Confirmed, Warden said, something like alarm entering its voice for the first time. It has been attempting to establish a return transmission since it reactivated. If it succeeds, it will provide the approaching chorus fleet with this vessel's exact location and defensive capabilities. Then we stop it, said, and against every instinct that told her to retreat, she stepped forward instead, driving toward the creature's shifting mass with the kind of reckless commitment she hadn't felt since her very first salvage run, decades ago, young and certain the universe couldn't touch her. It could touch her. It very nearly did, a limb lashing out, catching her shoulder, sending pain lancing down her arm as she fired point-blank into the pulsing core had identified. The creature shrieked, a sound with no vocal cords behind it, pure vibration tearing through the chamber. DOS and converged from either side, weapons trained on the same point, and Young, terrified but steady when it mattered, provided covering fire that kept the creature from pivoting to defend itself in time. The core ruptured in a burst of dark light. The creature collapsed. Silence rushed back into the chamber, broken only by their own ragged breathing and the quiet hum of Warden's systems recalibrating around them. The threat is neutralized, Warden said finally, and something in its voice, synthetic, ancient, built for a purpose no one alive had asked it to fulfill, sounded almost like relief. You succeeded where 642 boarding parties failed. Sank against the pillar, shoulder throbbing, staring at the ruined remains of something that had waited 11,000 years for exactly this moment and lost. Warden, she said, breathing hard. Did it manage to send the signal before we stopped it? The pause was too long, far too long. Partially, Warden admitted. A fragment was transmitted before the core ruptured, enough likely to confirm this vessel's location to whatever answered the original signal. Closed her eyes, so it's coming anyway. Yes, Warden said quietly. Something is already on its way. They had won the battle inside the ship. What waited beyond it was another matter entirely, and Warden did not sugarcoat the odds as it led them, exhausted and bleeding, back toward the chamber where their journey had begun. The outer doors, sealed since the moment they crossed the threshold, stood ahead of them now, still closed, still final. "Verification is complete," Warden said as they approached. "You have demonstrated restraint, cooperation, and the capacity to act against overwhelming odds without succumbing to panic or cruelty. By the standards set 11,000 years ago, you are deemed worthy successors." "Successors to what exactly?" asked, nursing her injured shoulder, too tired for diplomacy. "A ship full of secrets and a war we didn't even know existed until 6 hours ago." "Yes," Warden said without apology. "That is precisely what you have inherited." The doors began to open, the same slow, grinding motion that had sealed them in what felt like a lifetime ago, though the chronometer on suit insisted it had only been 11 hours. Beyond them, the stars waited, unchanged, indifferent to everything that had happened inside this ship's ancient hull. But Warden was not finished. "Before you leave, you should understand the full weight of what comes next," it said, and the tactical display flickered back to life one final time, showing the debris field beyond the ship, and beyond that a growing cluster of readings, faint, but unmistakably converging, unmistakably purposeful. "That's not one ship," Doss said slowly, reading the tactical spread with the eye of an engineer who understood scale even in his exhaustion. "That's a fleet." "Confirmed," Warden said. "Estimated arrival, 11 to 14 standard days, depending on approach vector. A chorus incursion force, likely dispatched the moment the infiltration unit's fragmentary signal confirmed this vessel's survival and location." His face had gone pale again, the reality of it settling in past the adrenaline of the fight. 14 days, and nobody out there even knows the chorus still exists. "No," Warden agreed. "Your civilizations have no record of them, no defenses prepared, no knowledge of what is coming." Stared out through the widening gap of the outer doors, at the stars, at the debris field, at a galaxy that had spent 11,000 years believing the war humanity fought and lost. Or won, depending on how one measured containment was ancient history, safely buried, never to return. "You're telling us this is our problem now," she said. It wasn't really a question. "I am telling you," Warden said, "that you are the only ones who know it is a problem at all. What you do with that knowledge is, as it has always been aboard this vessel, entirely your choice." The doors finished opening. Beyond them, the iron gull still hung in the debris field exactly where they'd left it, comm channels flooding with panicked messages from the crew who had waited outside for 11 hours with no contact and no way to help. Looked back at the ship, at Warden, at the reliquary somewhere behind them holding photographs of people who had smiled beneath a yellow sun, at the library full of a civilization's entire remaining memory, at the ruined husk of a creature that had waited 11,000 years for a war that was, impossibly, not yet over. "Warden," she said, "if we walk away right now, pretend none of this happened, what happens to this ship?" "I remain," Warden said simply, "as I have for 11,000 years, waiting for the next successors if you are unwilling to be the ones." Stepped up beside her captain, jaw set, the fear in her eyes now tempered by something harder, more resolved. "I'm not walking away from this." Looked at her crew, battered, frightened, changed, and understood, with a clarity that settled over her like the closing of a very old door, that none of them were walking away either. "Warden," she said, "tell us what humanity would have done. 14 days was not enough time to prepare a galaxy for a war it didn't know existed. It was, Warden insisted, enough time to prepare a beginning, and a beginning, in the end, was all any of them could offer." Stayed aboard the ship, as she'd known she would from the moment she first laid eyes on the derelict in the debris field. She and Warden began the impossible work of translating and preparing humanity's remaining archives for a galaxy that would need to understand, quickly, what it was about to face. It was slow, meticulous, humbling work, sifting through 10,000 years of a vanished civilization's grief and triumph, trying to distill it into something the modern factions could use before the chorus fleet arrived. Doss took charge of the ship's dormant weapon systems, working alongside Warden's tactical databases to bring 3 kilometers of ancient warship back to something resembling combat readiness. Not because 4 salvagers could crew a vessel built for thousands, but because Warden itself, fully awakened now, could operate far more of the ship autonomously than anyone had first realized. It would not be enough to win a war alone, but it would not need to be alone for long. Young and forever changed by 11 hours that had reshaped his entire understanding of the universe, became the one who carried the warning outward, riding the iron gull back through the debris field, back towards space, toward a captain's message that no one would believe until the stars themselves proved it true. Delivered that warning herself, standing before an incredulous council, describing an ancient warship, a vanished species, and a fleet no scanner had yet detected, but that Warden's calculations placed at 11 days out and closing. They did not believe her, not at first. Not until Warden, with help, transmitted a data burst containing 11,000 years of buried chorus engagement records. Proof enough, finally, that fear moved faster than skepticism when the alternative was extinction. By the time the chorus incursion fleet arrived at the edge of the debris field, it did not find an unarmed derelict and 4 terrified scavengers. It found a warship humanity had built to outlast their own extinction, crewed by successors who had earned that inheritance in 11 brutal hours, backed by a hastily assembled coalition of factions who, for the first time in their history, understood exactly what they were fighting and why. The battle that followed would be remembered, when it was over, as the first shot fired in a war that the galaxy had never known it inherited, a war humanity had paused rather than won, waiting patiently across 10 for someone willing to finish it. Warden watched it all unfold from the bridge it had guarded alone for 11,000 years, its ancient purpose finally, fully realized. And when the smoke cleared and the chorus fleet retreated to wherever its remnants regrouped, Warden composed a final log entry, not an ending, but a continuation of the same message it had first spoken to frightened boarding party all those days ago, when the doors sealed shut behind them and a war 11,000 years old finally found its next chapter. To whoever finds this record next, you have been chosen, the doors are open. What you do next is yours.